Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here, and on today's episode of Explained, we're going to be talking about guitar amp load boxes, what they are, how you use them, and why you might be interested in them, especially if you play through real tube amplifiers. I've got quite a few questions asking either how do I record my amp silently, or how can I play through my real amplifier through headphones or very low volumes without sounding like crap, and especially without waking the wife up in the middle of the night. And a lot of the times my answer does go back to some type of load box with a DI out solution. And I figured it only makes sense to explain exactly what they are, the nuances between them, and which ones I would recommend for that application. Before we talk about these specifically though, it's important to at least have a high level understanding of why you might need one of these devices in the first place. And it really comes down to that first word there, load. In this case, this is an 8 ohm load. If you look on the back of your amplifier, you're going to see one or more speaker jacks that will have similar numbers like 4, 8, or 16 ohms. And the power amp section of your amplifier is expecting one of those loads. And it's basically a resistor. You think of it as like a DC circuit. You have voltage, you have a resistor, and the resistor is the load on that circuit. In this case, most of the time, it is your speaker cabinet that's presenting that load. And if you don't have that load there, or you mismatch the impedance too much, most amplifiers have a pretty wide tolerance, but some are a lot less than others, so be sure if you're going to do something like that, then you run the risk of, or you will very probably quickly blow up the output transformer and possibly damage even more parts of your amplifier. There are very few amps out there. I know like Hughes and Kettner does make a couple that have internal load boxes that you can switch on and say, I'm not going to play through a speaker cabinet, so switch to this mode and you'll be fine. But if it's anything like the amps you see behind me, they have no such features, and you will have to have something like this if you're not going to play through a traditional speaker cabinet. Now, why might you not want to play through an actual speaker cabinet? That's kind of the bread and butter of guitar tone, right? Well, not everyone can crank the channel and master volume loud enough to get to that sweet spot tone to be able to record it properly, especially if you live in an apartment complex like I do. You most of the time can't even turn it past like 1 or 1.5 on a 10 scale without rattling the windows. So a lot of people require at the very least attenuation, but most of the time a silent recording setup. This load box in particular does have a minus 20 decibel output, which means you can plug in the speaker jack through here and output to your speaker cabinet, crank the volume as loud as you want to, and you'll still remain at a fairly reasonable level while, you know, attaining that really loud tone that is so ubiquitous. The second and more popular use case is the silent recording or silent playing setup. And that can be achieved through something like this. So this has a line dry output, which will basically just be tapped right off of your power amp sound. That means no speaker cabinet, no nothing. It's equivalent to the slave output or the raw output on the amps behind me. And if you listen to the raw signal of that, it's going to sound like absolute crap. And that's because your amplifiers were not designed to be played through stuff like, you know, studio monitors or headphones that are flat speakers. They need some-type of cabinet sound. The best substitution for a real cabinet microphone is of course impulse responses, which I have another explained episode on if you're not familiar with them. But if you want an all-in-one solution, this also has a guitar EQ and bass EQ cabinet sound, which is nowhere near the quality of a good impulse response. But Two Notes also makes other all-in-one solutions like the Torpedo Live that you can load impulse responses as well as use it as a load box. So really, this unit here is a go-between to something like a Fractal Audio device or your DAW, where then you can load cabinet impulse responses, and then you use that to play through your headphones or your studio monitors or whatever to get a silent recording or silent play setup. One of the coolest aspects about these little devices is if you use it the same way I do, it is completely passive, meaning you don't need a 9-volt power supply or anything like that. It's just taking a really loud signal, giving it a load to work with, and then stepping it down to be able to use it on any other equipment you may have. But that doesn't mean that all load boxes are created equally. Before I even get into this section of the video, I'm going to warn you right now. If you have an Amazon page pulled up or the Sweetwater website and you're looking for something like this, if you don't see the word reactive somewhere in the marketing material of that product, stay away. Don't buy it, because reactive is the difference between your amplifier sounding like a real full guitar amp and some type of fizzy digital, distortion pedal from the late 90s. It is that important. So what does it mean to be a reactive load box then? I said earlier you can kind of think of one of these as a resistor in a DC circuit, but it's actually not quite so simple, because we're dealing with frequency content here. And the dynamic response of a 200 hertz signal going through a speaker cabinet is going to be a lot different than a 2000 hertz signal. And your guitar and amplifier are producing a whole lot of frequencies. In the case of a real guitar speaker, you can think of the reactivity as kind of a curve that looks like this. You got a big bump in the 200 hertz region, kind of a scoop, and then it trails upward towards the upper mids. And this isn't an EQ curve. This is representing the dynamics of what happens when you put in low frequency versus high frequency content. You don't have to have a PhD level understanding of this to understand why the math works out that way, but it just does. And the way that you simulate that is with stuff like inductors. Stuff like inductors and capacitors react differently based on a signal's frequency content and make a really good substitute for that real reactivity you get out of a guitar speaker. So that's why when you see the words reactive, that's the one you should be going for, because they're using those types of AC circuit components that mimic those curves. And they're not perfect, none of them are, but they can get very, very close, as you'll hear from a sound snippet of this. I know Two Notes, Sur, a couple other brands that definitely advertise their stuff as reactive. With that said, you still should proceed with caution, because there are some reactive load boxes out here, like the one I hold in my hand, that pretty much does the bare minimum to be considered reactive. It's not as bad as being, super flat and distortion pedal sounding, but it's still nowhere near the quality of something like this or the Sur reactive loads. And you'll hear that in the demos. As I said before, if it doesn't have reactive somewhere in the marketing materials, I think they're kind of doing themselves a disservice with not putting reactive somewhere here on the shell. Stay away from it. I'm talking stuff like the Mesa Boogie Cab Clone. It is a straight resistive load, and because of that, you're going to get fizzle. You're going to turn your very expensive, lovely sounding amplifier when you play it through a room into, again, sounds like a multi-effects unit from the 90s, so don't bother with it. So for a quick wrap up, a load box acts as a liaison between your real tube amps, your digital gear, your recording interface, and allows you to play through stuff like headphones or flat speakers if you have an impulse response, and even if it has an attenuator, at least play through a real guitar cabinet at more reasonable volume levels. And if you've already invested into high quality tube amps, you really don't have an excuse not to shell out a couple $100 more bucks for a decent load box, because it will make it so much more capable. For me, I plan on using this to marry my real amps with my Fractal Audio AX8, use that as the impulse and effects loader, be able to switch out, rhythm and lead patches, but still use my real gear if I want to be able to do so. And overall, stuff like this is just the boon of a bedroom artist. If you want to play with the real gear you've always dreamed of having but can't get it to the levels you want, you don't have your own isolated cabinet, closet, and all that good stuff, you don't want to spend a lot of money on microphones, 'cause that's something a lot of people don't talk about, then you have your solution here. This plus some decent impulse responses will get you everything you need. If you get nothing else out of this video, buy reactive. I will say it again, buy a reactive load box. Skip all the resistive stuff. It will make your gear sound just awful. So yeah, Two Notes. This one I can vouch for personally, for good stuff from the Sur models. And there's a few more out there that I'm sure do just fine. And with that, that will be this episode of Explained. If you have other topics that you would like to see me cover, please leave them down below. We'll see if we can't get to them. And appreciate you watching as always. Thanks. Bye.